Hi, I'm Jerry Keucher. I'm the priest in charge at St. Mary's Church in Brooklyn. I've been the Chief Financial Officer of the Diocese of New York, and I've written a couple of books on church leadership and finance. You have access to a chapter of the book that's coming out this fall called Back from the Dead, the Book of Congregational Growth. I'll be referring to that chapter on budgeting from time to time in the discussion today. I'm really happy to be part of this series of web conferences in the Episcopal Church Foundation's Barnabas Project, which is aimed at providing resources on parish administration and finance to parish leaders in a practical and spiritually grounded way. I hope that's what you find in this discussion of budgets. Budgets are often seen as a rather deadening subject and one where people play all kinds of mind games and control games with each other. I want to offer the idea that how you handle the budget, that the budget can be a dynamic and strategic tool for helping you move your parish from where it is to a healthier financial position. The state of many parishes today is that parishes have structural deficits. This means that even if every income line comes in at the budgeted level and every expense line is kept down to the budgeted level, there's still insufficient resources to pay the budgeted expenses. Most parishes that have a structural deficit are making it up by either spending down their reserves or by blowing through their endowment. Even if you don't have a structural deficit, even if your current budget is reasonably balanced, most parishes, I would say, are underfunded, meaning that the level of resources that the income side provides are insufficient to provide the staff and programs necessary to have a thriving operation. So if this is the situation that many parishes are in, what does financial health look like? Well, I would say that financial health has at least these four components. First, the expense side provides sufficient staff and resources for a thriving operation. Second, the income side has sufficient resources to pay for those expenses, and that the budget is realistically balanced. Third, about 75% or more of operating funds come from individual contributions. This is a lot higher than what it is in most parishes, this target of 75%. Many parishes have 50% or less. The national average is about 60%. And finally, there's a separate revenue stream identified to fund the capital reserve. If you are not funding a capital reserve, you are, in other words, you're not setting aside money to do work on the buildings. You are actually, in effect, borrowing from the buildings every year. These loans are very easy to take out. There's no bank you have to go through. You just borrow from the buildings by not providing for capital needs. But then when the building wants to start getting paid and the loan comes due, it's very expensive and even traumatic. So, staff and resources to make a thriving operation. Sufficient revenue to pay for those resources. 75% of the operating budget coming from individual contributions, and a separate revenue stream to fund the capital reserve. In my very strong opinion, the way to fund the capital reserve is to direct the drawdown from the endowment to the capital reserve and wean the operating budget off of any dependence on endowments or investments. Now, very few parishes, according to these criteria, have a healthy, thriving financial operation. This does not mean that these criteria are unreasonable. It means that we've allowed ourselves to get accustomed to what in many cases is a woeful level of underfunding or a simply unsustainable level of overspending endowments and selling property and using it for operating expenses. So it's daunting, but if you know where you are in your own parish situation, and you know by these criteria where you'd like to be, then the budgeting process stops being a kind of tunnel vision thing of how do we make it through another year, usually meaning because we're losing a tenant or something like that, what expenses are we going to cut? It becomes a strategic document that helps you set some reasonable and concrete goals about how to move from where you are to in the direction of that healthy, thriving financial operation. Now, what do you need in order to get started down this road? Well, you do not need to spend a lot of time or money on strategic planning processes. You don't need a 40-year plan. You don't need a 5-year plan. All the strategic plans that I've seen along those lines generally set unreasonable goals. We're going to double attendance in 5 years or something like that, that people either never refer to again, or if they pull it out later, it makes them feel bad because it makes, well, of course, we didn't make that goal, and it makes it seem like nothing can be done. All you need to get started down this road of moving toward financial health is to have a sense that there is a future for my parish. And the future involves us being in a sustainable, healthy financial position so that we can do the work of the church. So you don't need a plan, you need a sense of direction. And you need to be able to sit down as you're doing the budget and as you're thinking about the financial future, about where you would like to move and what steps you can take this year that move you in that position. For example, let's say you don't have a capital reserve, but you do have a budget line that says major repairs, and you try not to spend it. You try to make it through the whole year without spending that budget. The first step you can take toward funding a capital reserve is to take that budget line and move it to a capital reserve account, a money market account or some other kind of separate from the operating account, and then do your capital improvements from there. Then in next year's budget, increase that line a little bit and move it into the capital reserve. I'm talking about little steps like that. We don't get from A to Z in 1 year, but we can get from A moving in the direction of B. How can we do a better job with our soliciting pledges? How can we start to talk about money in ways that don't communicate guilt and obligation, but instead empower people to be as generous to the parish that they love as they've always wanted to be? How can, if we're overspending the endowment, how can we rein that spending in? There's a discussion of that at the end of the chapter of Back from the Dead that you have access to. If you're in a situation where you're overspending your endowment, please look at that and think about how to integrate that into your financial operation, because overspending the endowment is like selling property every year and spending it on the light bill. It's unsustainable. And if your parish has a future, for the sake of the future, you want to stop doing that. How can we do this fundraising event better? How can we find a tenant for spaces that we're not using? If you're moving in a direction, then it becomes possible to think about these questions and to come up with, to open your minds and come up with some creative ideas. The idea that you don't have a future, and that the future is just going to be more of the past, is what deadens people and closes their minds so that they can't think of anything that they've never thought of before. Okay, so here's your homework. This is your homework that you've seen for the broadcast next week. Look at Chapter 7 of Back from the Dead if you have a chance, either before or after the webcast. And during the webcast, I'll be talking to you about ways to organize your financial statements so that they actually communicate information that the leadership needs to know in order to do a good job. Thanks.